What happens when a simple act of trust turns into a tragic nightmare? In 1913, the mysterious death of 13-year-old Mary Phagan shocked the town of Marietta, Georgia, and sent shockwaves through an entire nation. A story that has haunted the community and the justice system for over a century. The case of Mary Phagan holds more questions than answers. Today, we delve deep into the twisted events that led to her untimely passing. In 1913, Mary Phagan, a young, vibrant girl, was found lifeless in the basement of a local factory. The investigation that followed exposed dark secrets, prejudice, and confusion, creating a lasting legacy that still lingers today. This case isn't just about one young life. It's about a breakdown in the justice system, the danger of rushing to judgment, and how bias can cloud the truth. Mary was born in 1900 in the quiet town of Marietta, Georgia, a place that seemed like any other small town in the early 1900s. Her life wasn't perfect, but it was filled with simple joys. She lived with her mother, Lula Phagan, her brother, and her grandmother. Mary was known for her bright personality, always quick to help others and find joy in the little things in life. While her family wasn't wealthy, they were close-knit, and Mary worked hard to contribute in whatever way she could. She had a job at the National Pencil Factory, where she worked to help make ends meet for her family. Mary was just 13 years old, yet she had already begun to take on adult responsibilities, working to help support her family. Life was tough, but she had a dream of something better. She wanted more for herself, but her dreams, like many others, were about to be shattered. Despite the challenges she faced, Mary had an innocence about her, a sweetness that made her beloved by those who knew her. Her friends and family spoke of her kindness and work ethic, but no one could have imagined that the events unfolding around her would soon take a tragic and unexpected turn. At the time, Marietta was a tight-knit community, but it wasn't without its struggles. The social and economic tensions of the early 20th century were evident, with class divides, political unrest, and deep prejudices affecting the lives of everyday people. Mary's family, like many others, faced financial hardship, yet they worked together, hoping for a better future. Mary's job at the factory was an attempt to lift some of that burden, but it also placed her in a dangerous position. Her employer, Leo Frank, the factory manager, would soon become the focal point of an investigation that would change the course of history. Mary's life was shaped by the world around her, a world that was filled with hard work and little time for the luxuries of life. Yet, despite the difficulties, Mary had something many people didn't: hope. She dreamed of a life beyond the factory, beyond the small town, and beyond the struggle that defined her early years. But this hope was about to be stolen from her in the most unimaginable way. Her family, in their quiet home, never expected that their biggest fear would soon become their reality. Mary's story is a story of a girl who worked hard, loved her family, and dreamed of a better life. It's a story of a community that didn't know how to protect its own. Her passing, which seemed so senseless and so unfair, left a hole in the hearts of those who knew her. And the investigation that followed would uncover secrets that no one could have anticipated. In the small town of Marietta, the death of Mary Phagan was more than just a tragedy. It was the start of a dark chapter in the community's history that would continue to unfold in shocking ways. Let's dive deeper into the events that led to her final moments. What happened to Mary Phagan? How did she end up in that factory basement? And why did this tragedy spark such a complex and emotional chain of events? What followed was a trial that captivated the nation, filled with twists and turns, and a story that has left many questions unanswered to this day. Though everything seemed calm at first, there were strange signs that something was off in the days leading up to Mary's passing. Mary had been acting differently in the weeks before her disappearance. Some of her friends recalled her being more distant than usual, though no one could say for sure why. Mary had always been the kind of girl who smiled even in the face of hardship, but lately, something had shifted. She had started to keep to herself more, especially when she was at work at the National Pencil Factory. It was clear that something was bothering her, but she never spoke openly about it. Was it the pressure of supporting her family at such a young age, or was there something else troubling her that she didn't feel comfortable sharing? It wasn't entirely unusual for young people to keep their struggles to themselves, especially in those times. And though Mary had a tight-knit family, there was still a sense of isolation as she tried to make sense of the adult responsibilities she had to take on. As Mary went to work each day, the atmosphere at the factory seemed uneventful to most. But on the day she disappeared, the factory was already dealing with its own internal problems. Mary worked alongside other girls in a factory where working conditions were difficult. She wasn't the only young girl employed there, and the place was filled with people who seemed, for the most part, focused on their work. But there was one person in particular that Mary would interact with regularly: Leo Frank, the factory manager. Leo Frank was a 29-year-old Jewish man from Brooklyn, New York. He was known as being a bit distant and reserved, but he had a good reputation in the town as a hardworking businessman. Still, there was something unsettling about him to some of the factory workers. People noticed his demeanor. Something about him didn't sit quite right. Leo Frank was a manager, but some of the workers and even his colleagues found him hard to approach. It wasn't that he was cruel or malicious. He just had an air of distance about him. Mary and Frank had interacted regularly as she worked under his supervision, but in the days leading up to her disappearance, people started to notice small oddities in Frank's behavior as well. There were whispers around the factory that Frank had been acting nervously, especially after Mary's last visit to the factory that fateful day. He seemed more preoccupied than usual, distracted by something unseen. And while no one suspected anything serious at that point, the change in his behavior would become a significant part of the investigation that followed. The days leading up to her disappearance were not without signs, but they were subtle. There wasn't a clear, obvious clue to what was about to unfold. However, the tension in Mary's life was palpable. The small shifts in her behavior, the whispered suspicions about Frank, and the growing unease within the factory would soon collide in the most tragic way possible. The night before Mary went missing, she had told her family that she was going to pick up her paycheck from the factory. She left the house, as she had done many times before, but this time she didn't return. Hours passed, and her family grew worried. At first, they thought she might have gone to visit friends, or maybe she had gotten caught up with some other business. But as the hours stretched on into the night, the panic began to set in. It wasn't until the next morning that the harsh reality of the situation began to hit home. Mary hadn't returned. Her family immediately began searching the streets, asking around if anyone had seen her. They went to the factory, but there was no sign of her anywhere. The police were contacted, and the search for Mary intensified, but no one could have predicted what would come next. In the meantime, the factory workers and the town began to feel the weight of the situation. There were whispers of suspicion, murmurs about Leo Frank's behavior, and quiet speculation about what had happened to the young girl. But it wasn't until a few days later that the horrifying truth would begin to unravel. Mary's disappearance was already a mystery, but the questions surrounding Leo Frank would only grow as the investigation began. There was no clear evidence to link him to the incident at first, but the local authorities quickly began zeroing in on him. The suspicion surrounding his involvement escalated, driven in part by his actions and the growing public pressure for answers. The whole town, gripped by uncertainty, was left to wonder, where was Mary Phagan? And why had Leo Frank become the center of the investigation? This rising tension would ultimately lead to a tragedy that went far beyond the simple disappearance of a young girl. The investigation into her death, shrouded in mystery and confusion, would soon take a dark turn. Little did anyone know that the investigation was about to ignite a national debate, leading to an unjust trial, a shocking twist, and a community forever scarred by what happened next. As the investigation began, the town of Marietta was thrown into turmoil. The search for Mary Phagan stretched on for days, but it wasn't until April 28, 1913, 2 days after her disappearance, that the discovery was made. Mary's lifeless body was found in the basement of the National Pencil Factory where she had worked. The location was strange. It was tucked away in a dark, secluded area, a place no one would expect to find someone's body. Her family, of course, was devastated, but they were also left with more questions than answers. How did she get there? Who was responsible? When the police arrived at the factory, they immediately began to examine the scene. The factory was eerily quiet, with no obvious signs of forced entry or a struggle. There was no indication that anyone had broken into the building. It didn't look like an attack had taken place in the usual sense. There were no loud noises or violent disruptions that might have tipped someone off. The scene didn't match the typical image of a violent crime. The police began their investigation by speaking to Leo Frank, the factory manager. Frank had been one of the last people to see Mary alive. He had been present at the factory when she left for her paycheck and was one of the last people to interact with her. As the authorities questioned him, they started to find inconsistencies in his story. Frank seemed nervous, and his alibi was shaky. He said that he had left the factory shortly after Mary had left, but there was no one to confirm his whereabouts at the time she disappeared. It was then that the investigation took a dramatic turn. Jim Conley, a janitor who worked at the factory, came forward with a startling story. Conley claimed to have witnessed Leo Frank in a suspicious state shortly after Mary went missing. According to Conley, Frank had acted oddly when he was called upon to help with the investigation, and his story had changed a few times. What was even more chilling was Conley's testimony that he had helped Frank dispose of the body after it was discovered, leading authorities to believe there was more to the story than anyone had realized. This was a game changer for the case. Conley's testimony, along with the inconsistencies in Leo Frank's own statements, led the police to make an arrest. Leo Frank was charged with the crime, despite the lack of solid evidence against him. The town was already in an uproar. Many people, fueled by racial and religious prejudices, began to demand justice, and Frank, a Jewish man, became the center of a growing wave of suspicion. The case was no longer just about Mary Phagan's death. It became a trial that would capture the attention of the entire country, setting the stage for a public spectacle that would last for years. At the same time, the investigation was plagued with flaws. Many of the police officers were ill-equipped to handle such a high-profile case, and their methods were often hasty. There was little physical evidence to tie Frank directly to the crime, but the focus shifted to his background, his demeanor, and his connections. The community was hungry for answers, and Frank became an easy target. The media sensationalized the case, fueling public outrage and leading to an unfair trial. As the trial unfolded, the tension in the town grew. People took sides, and the community became more divided. Frank's defenders argued that the case was based on circumstantial evidence and that the real killer was still out there. But the prosecution was determined to make an example of Frank, portraying him as guilty before any real evidence was presented. The trial, which began in mid-July 1913, lasted for nearly a month. It was a spectacle that the entire country watched, with newspapers publishing daily updates and commentators making their own predictions. The fate of Leo Frank, the Jewish factory manager, was now in the hands of a jury that had already formed an opinion before the trial had even begun. As the days went by, it became clear that Leo Frank's chances of being acquitted were slim. The emotional pressure was mounting, and the town's animosity towards Frank was only growing. The prosecution's case seemed weak, but the jury's bias was strong. By the end of the trial, Leo Frank was convicted of the crime and sentenced to death. This was only the beginning of a much larger, far-reaching story. The trial and the subsequent events would set off a chain reaction that would rock the town of Marietta and the entire nation. It wasn't just about the crime anymore. It was about the social and racial tensions that had been simmering for years, and the way those tensions played a role in the justice system. The questions that remained after the trial were more than just legal ones. They were deeply moral and philosophical, and they would continue to haunt the town long after the verdict was delivered. The arrest, the trial, and the outcome would have a lasting impact on the people of Marietta, and the story of Mary Phagan would continue to be told for generations. But at this point, the question remained, was Leo Frank really guilty? Or was he simply a victim of a broken system, one that allowed prejudice and fear to dictate the truth? Weeks passed after Leo Frank's conviction, but the tension surrounding the case was far from over. The investigation, trial, and verdict had left the town of Marietta and the entire nation divided. Some were convinced of Frank's guilt, while others believed that the trial had been a miscarriage of justice. The case continued to stir emotions, and as pressure mounted, a shocking event occurred that would leave the entire country in disbelief. The first major twist came when an appeal for a new trial was filed. In 1914, the Georgia Supreme Court ruled to uphold Frank's conviction, despite arguments that the trial had been flawed. As a result, Frank's supporters intensified their efforts to fight for his innocence, and his defense team continued to gather evidence that they believed could prove his innocence. This included the fact that there was no concrete physical evidence linking him directly to Mary's death, and many questioned the credibility of the key witness, Jim Conley. Despite these efforts, the weight of public opinion remained firmly against Frank. His trial had become a spectacle, with much of the nation following the case through the media. The racial and religious aspects of the case had led many to view it through a lens of deep-seated prejudice, making it hard for people to see beyond their biases. The town of Marietta was torn, and as the days went on, it seemed like there was no way to settle the debate. Frank's fate was sealed when, in 1915, Georgia Governor John M. Slatton, under immense pressure, commuted Frank's sentence from death to life in prison. This decision sparked an even greater public outcry, and many felt that justice had been denied to Mary Phagan and her family. The situation in Georgia reached a boiling point. A group of individuals, angry and emboldened by the public's perception of Frank's guilt, decided to take matters into their own hands. They formed a vigilante group with one goal in mind: to execute Leo Frank. On the night of August 16, 1915, a mob of approximately 25 men, including prominent members of the community, broke into the prison where Frank was being held. Despite the authorities' efforts to protect Frank, the mob overpowered the guards and abducted him from his cell. Leo Frank was taken to a remote location near Marietta where he was lynched. The lynching of Leo Frank sent shockwaves across the nation. While some saw it as a form of justice, many others, including those who had long believed in his innocence, were horrified by the mob's actions. Frank's death was a tragic end to a case that had already been filled with tragedy, injustice, and confusion. In the aftermath, his lynching only further divided the public and left the question of his guilt or innocence hanging in the air. Despite the emotional reaction from some, there were many who believed that Frank's execution by a mob was a grave injustice. The lynching of Leo Frank marked a tragic chapter in American history, not only because of the way it was carried out, but because of the deep racial and anti-Semitic undercurrents that influenced the case from the very beginning. For many, Frank's death symbolized how fear and prejudice could override the law and the pursuit of true justice. In the years that followed, the case would continue to reverberate. In the 1980s, new investigations and research into the case reopened the discussion about Frank's innocence. Some historians and legal experts have argued that Frank may have been wrongly convicted, suggesting that the true killer could have been someone else entirely. The case remains a haunting reminder of the dangers of mob mentality, the consequences of a biased legal system, and the power of prejudice in shaping a person's fate. Leo Frank's story is a tragic one, a story of a man caught in a web of suspicion, injustice, and societal bias. His lynching and the events leading up to it reflect the deep racial and religious tensions of the time and continue to serve as a cautionary tale. As for Mary Phagan, her name is still tied to this dark chapter in history. The questions surrounding her death remain unresolved, and the legacy of the case lingers in the hearts of those who remember the pain and confusion it caused. Even after over a century, the case of Mary Phagan and Leo Frank is still one of the most discussed and debated stories in American criminal history. The twists and turns of the investigation, trial, and eventual lynching of Leo Frank leave us with more questions than answers. What happened to Mary Phagan on that fateful day in 1913? Was Leo Frank really guilty, or was he simply a victim of prejudice and a flawed justice system? And what does this case tell us about the dangers of fear, bias, and rushing to judgment? These are the questions that continue to haunt the town of Marietta, and they are questions that we may never fully answer. The case of Mary Phagan and Leo Frank left a lasting impact on both the town of Marietta and the broader American society. It highlighted the deeply ingrained prejudices of the time, as well as the flaws within the justice system. The aftermath of the case would forever change the way people viewed justice, race, and bias in the American legal system, and it sparked debates that continue to this day. The trial and conviction of Leo Frank exposed how easily a person could become a target of public opinion, especially when they were a minority or different from the societal norm. Frank's case showed the dangers of rushing to judgment and the influence of social and racial biases. While there was no concrete physical evidence tying him directly to the crime, the hysteria surrounding his trial painted him as guilty, and public sentiment played a powerful role in his eventual conviction. After Leo Frank's lynching in 1915, the case didn't end. It continued to ripple through the community and the country. Many saw Frank's execution as an act of justice, particularly those who believed he was guilty. However, others felt it was a tragic miscarriage of justice, a direct consequence of a justice system clouded by prejudice, racial hatred, and fear. The harsh reality was that Leo Frank became a victim of the mob mentality, an innocent man who, in many eyes, was denied due process and legal fairness. The fact that a mob could take justice into their own hands, ignoring the court's decision, was a frightening reminder of the dangers of mob rule and the fragility of the legal system. For the town of Marietta, the lynching of Leo Frank didn't bring the closure they expected. The community remained divided, with some continuing to believe Frank was guilty and others convinced that he had been wrongfully convicted. The impact of Frank's death lingered long after the trial ended. The emotional scars from both the trial and the subsequent lynching stayed with the community. People who had once been neighbors now lived with a deep mistrust of each other, their bonds broken by the violence and injustice that had unfolded. The legacy of the Mary Phagan case also had a profound impact on the national conversation about justice and race. The case exposed the racial and religious tensions of the time, particularly the anti-Semitic sentiment that surrounded Leo Frank due to his Jewish heritage. The trial was a reflection of a broader societal issue in America, where minorities, particularly Jewish people, often faced unfair treatment and were quick to be blamed for crimes they did not commit. In the years following Frank's death, his case would be cited as an example of the dangers of prejudice in the legal system. The legacy of this case didn't stop at the trial. In the 1980s, the case was reopened, and forensics experts began to examine the evidence once again. New theories emerged, suggesting that the true killer could have been someone else entirely. Some historians and legal experts argue that Leo Frank was a victim of both a corrupt legal system and the social prejudices that permeated the community. The re-evaluation of the case sparked renewed interest in the story of Mary Phagan and Leo Frank. and it became a symbol of the ongoing struggle for fairness and equality in the American legal system. The case also played a significant role in the history of the American civil rights movement. It highlighted how deeply embedded racism and prejudice could influence a legal case, even when the evidence was unclear. The outrage over Leo Frank's lynching and the subsequent debates about his guilt or innocence exposed the limitations of the legal system in dealing with race-related issues. It was a crucial moment that showed the need for change and reform in how justice was served, particularly for marginalized communities. Mary Phagan's story, though overshadowed by the larger discussion of Leo Frank's fate, also left an indelible mark on American history. The brutal loss of such a young life was a tragedy in itself, but the way her case was mishandled by the authorities and the legal system showed how easily the truth can be obscured when the powers that be are swayed by fear, bias, and public opinion. Mary became a symbol of the injustice that so many innocent people face, especially when their case is manipulated by outside forces. The final reflection on the case is that it serves as a haunting reminder of the need for justice to be served fairly and without bias. The case showed how fear, prejudice, and assumptions could lead to the ruin of innocent lives. Leo Frank's story should have been a testament to the importance of due process, the protection of individual rights, and the need for a fair trial based on the facts, not on public hysteria. It's a lesson that we must continue to learn from, ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. In the years that followed, many in the Jewish community in America saw Leo Frank's case as an example of the deep-rooted anti-Semitism that could drive people to act irrationally and unjustly. The case sparked changes in how the country viewed justice for minorities, though the work towards fairness and equality is ongoing. For Mary Phagan, her case and the tragic events surrounding it continue to serve as a painful reminder of how lives can be destroyed by bias, fear, and a broken system. The story of Mary Phagan and Leo Frank is more than just a criminal case. It's a reflection of the society in which it took place. It's a story about the failures of the justice system, the power of prejudice, and the consequences of unchecked public opinion. And it's a story that still echoes in the minds of those who remember it, a story that reminds us to be vigilant in the fight for justice, fairness, and equality.